Hello, true believers, and welcome to another edition of BK's Bullets. My name is not Brent Cassina. My name is Jim Afanis, and from time to time, Brent asks me to review comic books for you. Today, I'll be taking a look at The Punisher. Welcome back, Frank. So The Punisher, Welcome Back, Frank, is by Garth Ennis, Jimmy Palmiotti, and Steve Dillon. And it's a pretty dense book. I did a little bit of research on this to kind of understand why there is a label known as the Marvel Knights. And essentially, this was something that started back in the late 90s. It was a kind of reimagining of some of the Marvel franchises right after their bankruptcy. And basically a lot of these authors were given a lot of creative liberty with a handful of characters to kind of do whatever they wanted. And they're supposed to be more compact stories, not these long sweeping arcs that you normally see throughout normal comic books where a story could last many, many issues. This is more like a compact, easy to digest story, which is great for me because I don't have any history or knowledge whatsoever of the Punisher. All I know is that it's a dude who wears a skull shirt and he murders a lot of people. And boy, oh boy, is the body count high in this comic. But before I get into that, do me two quick favors. Number one, if you have not yet read this comic book, save this video for later because I will be getting into spoilers. And number two, comment, rate, and subscribe to Brent's channel. It will definitely help him with his goal of comic book, YouTube domination, and YouTube monetization, which, hey, who doesn't like that, right? And the guy does a lot of really good stuff on comics. So, I mean, come on, this is the right place to be. Now, what is Welcome Back, Frank about? Well, it's interesting. There's actually a couple side stories going on in this comic. And I have to say, ultimately, I thought it was a fun read. Would I say it's a required read? Probably not. Did it change the way I view comics? Was it this deep, engrossing story like we saw in Batman Year One? No, definitely not. This is a largely forgettable story, but a fun read nonetheless. There were some really interesting action scenes that took place throughout the story, and there were some satisfying endings and then some not so satisfying endings. So let's dive into everything about the comic. It starts off with Frank basically being the gritty Punisher that we know. And this guy just goes around essentially and kills mob bosses and other people in memoriam and this vendetta from his wife and his child. So he's just an angry man with a lot of weapons. He has no supernatural talent or no special abilities other than he is very, very resourceful when it comes to weaponry. And he seems to be able to fight and have this ridiculous amount of stamina later on in the comic when he gets beat for essentially a book. He gets pulverized by this other dude and somehow still finds a way to successfully win. The story picks up with him taking out this crime family and systematically murdering people. And honestly, I was getting kind of bored with the comic through, I would say, the first 4 or 5 books, because all that happens is he just continues to win. There's absolutely no threat to him whatsoever. He befriends the people in his apartment block. Outside of those small interactions with people, it's him just basically taking people out. And one of the frustrations I have, and it's not necessarily towards this comic, it's just towards this particular type of art in general. Drawing a gunshot is a very difficult thing to do because outside of a tracer, you don't really see it. So a lot of these look like energy explosions. So it's like a big thick line and then like a splash, almost like an energy beam hitting like a wall or something. It doesn't always look very believable. A lot of times you get these little bullet holes where you'll see the aftermath of somebody with like small little holes in their chest or their head or whatever. Very rarely do we see that gory aftermath, and that's something I appreciate. I don't necessarily need to see that. However, a lot of times it's just done in shadows or kind of off frame, and it's just kind of, based on the character's reactions or them throwing up or something like that, do we kind of visualize just how intense the violence is. So moment to moment, despite the fact that there is a significant amount of gunplay, it doesn't come off as like a really gory type of comic, and I appreciated that. So Frank is systematically taking out this family. Mostly just him walking up to people and shooting them or getting in these huge shootouts. He does take some damage, but he seems to be very capable of, repairing himself, so to speak, going back to his apartment and stitching himself up and getting new weaponry and new leads. Things take a turn later on when these, one of the women that the mom of the crime family, she gets mauled by a bear and she loses both of her limbs and a lot of her hair, which she's basically just like the stump. She recruits this guy known as the Russian, and the Russian is going to be the equalizer that's going to finally finish off the Punisher. So while the Russian is making his way onto the scene, there's a couple other things I want to mention because they all kind of culminate at the end. As I mentioned, Frank is befriending the people in his apartment, which will come in handy in a little bit. And additionally, there's a detective who is trying to, basically, this is his first case. He knows that this crime family is deeply connected to the police chief and the commissioner and that sort of thing and the mayor. So he's kind of sent on a fool's errand to try to basically figure out what's going on and trying to stop this crime family. Ultimately, he is just kind of the background conscious and the kind of like noise. He really doesn't serve much of a purpose. And honestly, throughout the read, I didn't care about him. His name was Soap. I think of Soap McTavish from Call of Duty, which that's probably the coolest reference I could think, but obviously they're not related. But Soap is just kind of a blundering idiot, and he gets picked on a lot. He doesn't really do much. He has a couple mental breakdowns throughout the comic where he cries to his partner, this woman who is kind of more hard-nosed than him. And honestly, that whole story arc falls flat. I don't really understand really his purpose. It's not like he provides any of the like detective or police side of things, similar to like what Batman does in Detective Comics, where you get to see the investigative piece of things and then you have the action side. The cop doesn't provide the detective side of things, so it kind of falls flat, honestly. Additionally, you have these three villains. One guy who calls himself the Holy, who's this preacher. Another guy who calls himself Mr. Payback, and another guy who calls himself Epic. Faith, what was his name? He had a really bizarre name. It was just a single name. Honestly, it's really irrelevant. He's just the third guy. And they basically start to become like, sort of like Punisher, going around murdering people really for no reason, and they begin to idolize the Punisher. So I glanced over one small thing, and you're probably watching this thinking, geez, Jim, you're really jumping around it. And the truth is, this comic book jumps around a lot. It's a lot of small stories that have arcs that you won't see for a couple, books, and then suddenly they're talking about these characters again, which is a criticism I'm going to hold till the end. I'm just still trying to lay out the plot for you guys. There's a small cameo with the Daredevil, where the Punisher basically forces the Daredevil to kill him or to watch him kill somebody. So basically the Daredevil is tied to like this pole, and he has a revolver in his hand with a single bullet, and Frank is going to now snipe somebody right in front of the Daredevil. And the Daredevil has the option of intervening by shooting Frank and then essentially becoming a murderer, or doing nothing and being an accomplice in this crime, which probably was the most morally interesting part of the story. Unfortunately, it only lasts about 3 pages. The Daredevil ultimately decides to pull the trigger to kill Frank, but Frank rigged the gun in such a way that it will not go off. Ultimately, Frank kills the target. The Daredevil is a quote-unquote accomplice to murder, and then he's never seen again. It was a very bizarre reference to the Daredevil. I would have loved to see more of that, because the Daredevil definitely comes from a place of a much more moral high ground, and Frank is definitely opposite of that. Unfortunately, it's a very small interaction that only takes place, like I said, in a couple pages, and then it's completely forgotten about and never mentioned again. I'm not really sure what the intent of that was. Potentially, they wrote it in and they felt it was too edgy and they took it out in future story or arcs. I don't know. Ultimately, the big fight between the Russian and the Punisher ends with the Punisher using this big fat guy who's been living across the street across the hall from him. He pushes the fat guy on top of the Russian and smothers him, and the Russian suffocates by this large fat guy laying on him. It was bizarre. It was really, really bizarre. Leading up to it, there was a great fight where the Russian is ripping off refrigerator doors and toilets and window sills and air conditioners and things like that, and using them as weapons to basically beat Frank around for about 2 books, two whole chapters worth of fighting. Ultimately, Frank just pushes this fat guy on top of him and he dies. Then cuts his head off, because why not? Brings it to the evil villain, who's the stump woman, lights her house on fire, and then she jumps out of the window to fight him, and Frank punts her like a football back into the fire, then goes to he runs into Soap, gives Soap a bunch of files. Soap somehow becomes the police commissioner, and then Frank goes off and murders the other 3 vigilantes that were kind of ancillary to the story. And that's the end. Ultimately, I thought it was bizarre. Like I said, it was an interesting read. It was fun. I think the art is really pretty. I think drawing the gunfire, as I mentioned, is a little hard to do, but I applaud that they were able to show the lethality and the brutality of gunplay without really getting over the top, and it wasn't like a snuff film or anything like that. I liked the Punisher's, when he's vulnerable, about halfway through the story, he basically gets in this really bad firefight and he gets shot up pretty bad, and it's clear that he needs help from these friends that he befriended. The fat guy who gets pushed on top of the Russian at the end, plus 2 other people that are kind of ancillary to the story. He kind of takes them under his wing, and ultimately they help him recover, which was nice. It was nice to see that he was kind of building a small coalition, if you will, of people to be loyal to him, and I like that, especially since they knew who he was and what he had done. They still chose to help him, which I thought was noble, and I like that. And I was hoping we would get more character development with them, but ultimately they served just that purpose. They were written up basically to that point. Following that point, they're essentially written out, except for a throwaway panel at the end of the story when Frank returns and gives them all stacks of money as a thank you. Outside of that, they really built up this fight with this Russian guy who was a really interesting villain, incredibly super strong, who died by suffocation to a fat guy who apparently had a weakness to fire somehow. I guess Frank throws a pizza on him and he gets really weak. That wasn't really explained that well. I don't know if it matters or not. He really seemed like a throwaway villain. Frank never really seemed in any peril in this, and I don't know if that's a common theme in The Punisher or not. He definitely seemed to be able to handle himself with ease, incredibly easily dispatching waves and waves. I counted over 100 people before I quit counting of him taking people out systematically by stabbing or grenades or gunshots or vehicle, like running them over. He's definitely very well-versed in the art of murder, I guess we'll say. Do I like Frank more or less after reading this? I didn't know much about him. He's an interesting anti-hero. I didn't really get a lot of backstory so much with his wife and his kid, but I understand that not every story needs to have that. You just need to know that going into it. But in terms of like moral dilemma and facing, his demons or whatever, he definitely does not do that in this comic. And he seems to go above and beyond, almost torturing the Daredevil in that one scene where he forces the Daredevil to either shoot him or watch him murder somebody, which I know had to be hard on the Daredevil. So would I read another Punisher comic? Well, if Brent picks one out, of course I will. I don't know if I'd actively seek them. I go back to The Dark Knight Returns as the gold standard in comics, particularly drawing on this particular part of it, Batman's real dilemma with returning to being the Dark Knight and really trying to understand what that means, and him coming to terms with the fact that he created the evil that he fights. Did the Joker make Batman, or did Batman make the Joker? That was something that was very heavily explained and discussed in that comic, a lot of self-internalization. Here, these legion of villains, as I mentioned before, that Punisher basically liquidates at the end of the comic, Frank didn't really seem to have any connection to them. He didn't really seem to feel responsible for them. He just kind of was like, oh yeah, they're here and they need to die. He didn't really seem to take ownership of his actions. And in that sense, he doesn't really seem self-aware. So that's why I feel this is kind of like a throwaway comic. It's just something fun and goofy to read. You're going to get some nice action scenes. You're going to get some beautiful artwork. You're going to enjoy the story, I guess, if you like watching people just get systematically liquidated and eradicated. But outside of the main arc there, you know, the throwaway story with the cop, the throwaway story, well, maybe not so much as a throwaway story with his roommates, but not really culminating into much of anything. Definitely the Russian and that whole battle at the end was very nonsensical. Ultimately, I think it falls flat on a lot of things. But despite me panning it, it was okay. I don't know if I'd recommend it. I don't think you need to run out and buy it right now. I'm glad Brent let me borrow it because I didn't know much about the Punisher. Now I can say that I do. So with that, leave your comments below. Let me know what you thought about this particular comic. Again, the name of the game is Punisher. Welcome home, Frank. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Take care of yourselves. And until next time, I will see you guys in the funny pages.